Joe Rogan and Russell Brand go on a journey towards truth, as one might say. The funny thing about this podcast episode is just how much time I spent agreeing with Joe and Russell. I'm a fairly conservative Christian thinker, and so either my theology is way off or like God is up to something and there's a spiritual awakening going on. But you tell me, am I totally off or is God up to something? So stick around towards the end as we move from the curious and the interesting to the meaningful, and then you can let me know if I'm crazy. Let's go.
Like, you know, when you have people on here like Graham Hancock and Randall Carlson that talk about like the potential for like these seismic events, cataclysmic events that have reset civilization, it makes you recognize that all of our reference points, other than biological and cosmological, are cultural reference points and therefore temporal. And so a person living...
Did you notice that the reference points being biological, cosmological, and cultural? I think the cosmological reference point is the one to like anchor yourself into. That would be my my thought.
And living in a tent in the street is in a sense living a hunter-gatherer lifestyle in contemporary America, or living a post-apocalyptic lifestyle in contemporary America. It makes me think sometimes, Joe, maybe the apocalypse is not a forthcoming event. Maybe the apocalypse has already happened. Maybe we're living in the sort of already its gentle threads are encroaching upon apparent civilization. You know?
Okay, so this is something for Christians to think about. There is this sense in the New Testament that the kingdom of God has been inaugurated, but hasn't been consummated. It's sort of already, but not yet. It has started, but the end hasn't quite come. And every generation seems to think that we live in the end of the end times. But is it just a single moment of some apocalyptic event, or is it a progression of time that leads us to that?
Civilization, you know, when you're in comfortable, defined and designed spaces, you feel like everything's okay. The end of the world is impossible. And it just seems like entertainment when you hear about nuclear treaties being torn up, that it can't actually happen. But
is that entertainment for us, really? Okay, so I know I said that we start with like the curious and go towards the meaningful. I actually feel like we're starting with we're kind of starting with the dark side of things. This is like 5 minutes into this episode. So, of course, go check out the episode. We're not going to cover everything. Go check out the episode. I forget what the episode number is. But, yeah, we're starting off with the apocalypse, nuclear war, and then it does go a little bit dark. But, yeah, the people in the West sit back and think, oh, yeah, like we read dystopian novels and think how great that would be. And it's like, no, go to a different part of the world and realize they've been living in kind of apocalyptic, dystopian conditions for quite some time, and it's not entertaining.
But of course it can. It's so temporal.
It's happened forever. It's always happened. The people that it happened to then, they never saw it coming either. The way you're saying is very interesting, because I think the apocalypse is here on Earth. It's just not here. Like right here in Austin.
It's
not like right here in the studio, but it's in the Congo.
Yeah.
Like if you go to a cobalt mine in the Congo and you see a 19-year-old woman with a baby on her back mining for cobalt and inhaling toxic fumes, you're like, okay, well that's the apocalypse. Yeah. They have no electricity. They have no clean water. They make very, very little money, and they work all day. And they work for a company that puts cobalt into lithium-ion batteries that are in everyone's smartphone. So the height of our technology is directly connected to its essentially slave labor. And
that's a whole thing in and of itself. But for people that have been there, I haven't been to the Congo. I was in Uganda in 2004, and you come to a very quick realization that the world can be a horrible place. And the question before us, and again, this is kind of moving from sort of curious and going to meaningful. The meaningful question in front of us is, what is the only hope for humanity? Like, what is our hope? And as a Christian person, I look at the world, and it it helps me to explain it. Now, there's a tension there because I believe God is good, and yet I see the world as a broken and fallen place. But I can see evil for what it is, and I can call evil evil. And then with that, I can move forward into the question of what is our only hope? What is our hope moving forward? How can I address that evil? Is there justice that's going to be done? You know, those kinds of questions come out of this realization that the world can be a pretty messed up place, man. So yeah, like I said, we're kind of starting with some of the dark stuff, but again, it's going to push us into these meaningful dialogues, meaningful questions.
And that's the apocalypse. I mean, that might as well be the apocalypse. That might as well be Mad Max. It might as well be. I mean, it's just as bad. It's just as horrific.
There's a very beautiful
I'm a
bit
fan
of
of Mad
investigation.
Max,
I saw that episode.
Siddharth Kara, yeah, he wrote that. What is the book called? Cobalt Red. Yeah, it's all about cobalt mining in the Congo and his investigation that he did into it. It's very, very. It's inspiring that a person is that selfless and can make that sort of a commitment and risk their life and go to a very dangerous place and expose this because he's a real journalist, like a real boots on the ground journalist that wants to show the world some things that are being hidden from them because the people that are making enormous amounts of money from this that could fix it don't want to. They want to profit off of it at the exact level they're profiting off of it now, which means, paying people a couple cents an hour or whatever they pay them. It's horrific.
Yeah,
It's
terrible.
a template that is unfortunately imprinted.
Of course, I say that while I talk into a microphone, into a computer with my freaking cell phone sitting next to me. So, yeah, I don't know. I wrestle with this. This is something I wrestle with. I don't know. I don't know where I land just yet. Obviously, these things are horrible, and obviously I have a bit of a conflict internally when it comes to that, knowing that kind of like our cars and our phones and our computers and this stuff is like, where did it all come from?
When we talk about what are the ideologies that drive us, the ideology of progress, this is why I have sometimes am skeptical, not about technology, the mastery and the geniuses that work in that field, but how technology and science as a subset of our economic ideology can create exactly the conditions that you are describing and that journalist has exposed. That if your ideology...
Okay. I might have to watch that again, but what are the ideologies that drive these kinds of conditions that we're seeing in the world, and what is the root cause? If I believe that people are by nature good and perfectible, why do I see this kind of exploitation? From a Christian worldview, I use the word sin. I see these things happening, and I say, well, that's sin. And I can point to it, I can look at it, and then realizing that there are ideologies that hold people captive in that evil, in that sin, that keep them exploiting other people, and then we have to realize, am I participating in that? And if I am, how do I not?
Permits that, then what kind of ideology is that? What kind of unconsciousness are we living in? It's not an awakened culture. And all of the discourse around, how we treat one another as individuals and progressivism culturally in domestic territories, hey, people should be allowed to do this and that. It's a nonsense if that is permitted. Not only permitted, required. It's a requirement. You cannot have that economic model without that price being paid. And as a culture, whether it's me as an individual or our entire culture, we've accepted that contract. We've accepted that.
Yeah, we're not awakened. Are there alternatives to this? Are there alternatives to living? Have we just accepted kind of a apocalyptic style, technocratic, totalitarian, propagandized culture? Or is there hope that we can break free from that? I think there is. As a Christian person, I see that in the person of Jesus, that there is always hope. And I kind of mentioned this in the last episode on Eric Weinstein. And what it is that people who are afraid can be easily manipulated. And so how do we escape that cycle? I point to the person of Jesus. Maybe you have some other suggestion that you want to lend to us, but it has to be something that's powerful enough to bring us out of this system that we're in. And there's just, outside of the resurrection of Jesus Christ, I know of no other hope for humanity.
Accepted those terms.
All right.
Well, we have.
All right. We're gonna find another spot here. We're gonna jump. I'm actually gonna jump quite a bit. I'm gonna go about an hour and a half into this thing before we catch another piece that we want to talk about.
They're inching us closer to nuclear war. They're pushing dangerous pharmaceutical drugs into our lives. They're instituting a centralized digital currency and a credit score system and controlling people and locking people down and establishing narratives that are not based on fact at all. But if you don't follow lockstep with that narrative, you're fucked and you're out of a job. And so everybody doesn't know what to do. Next thing you know, we have something that's very similar to what's going on in China. And that can happen. We're not that far away from something like that happening here. All it would take is a large disaster, some sort of an attack, some sort of a terrible scenario where a bunch of people died and they had to change the rules in order to protect us. And next thing you know, you're fucked.
Yeah, like 9/11 led to surveillance.
Yes.
The pandemic led to compliance.
Yes.
And one of those tropes of the kind of avowed conspiracy theorist that we mentioned earlier was that crisis is used to induce measures that they want to induce anyway.
Yeah, and so this is what it is. How do you make a group of people vulnerable to manipulation? You scare the crap out of them. That's how you do it. That's how you get people to comply. And so can we escape this cycle of fear? And I think the early church would be a group of people that I would reference you to. I would say that you can look at what they went through. And there's others, but they seemed to meet the challenges and the persecution with a sense of hope and not fear. Certainly that's not 100%, but it does seem that way. So how do we escape the cycle of fear and then manipulation? Scare people, then you can they become vulnerable, and then you can manipulate them and make them do whatever you want. And I think people that have the ability to think for themselves, spiritually awakened, those types of people that are on the journey towards truth. And ultimately, I found truth in the person of Jesus. I think those people are less able to be manipulated. I only hesitate to say that because I wonder who might be watching.
Anyway, and one of the things that was spoken about in the pandemic was, oh, look, they had this agenda anyway. They were looking to introduce this kind of technology.
They just took advantage of a situation. I don't go as far as saying that I think that people orchestrate these things. I don't think anybody orchestrated the pandemic. I think the pandemic came out of that Wuhan lab. I think they fucked up. There's clear evidence that in 2018 they already have safety violations. It wasn't well done. The people in the lab got sick. They know who the people were that got sick. They know one of the spouses of one of the people that worked in the lab died from something that seems very similar to COVID. They know the history. They know what happened. But the way they took advantage of that situation reminds me of the way they took advantage of 9/11.
Yeah.
Because I don't think they orchestrated 9/11 either. I could be wrong on both counts. I want to be really clear about that. I don't know how things work. But I
mean, you have to appreciate that, right? That this is one of the reasons why Joe Rogan's podcast, I think, is very popular. It's very accessible to people, is that Joe himself, and oftentimes the people that he has on there, are willing to think about things. They're willing to be wrong about things. And that appeals to people. If you're just like, listen to me, I know it all, then it's like, okay, there's no conversation to be had. I can't express my voice or my thoughts. And so what do? I just sit there and listen? Well, that's not as interesting as, somebody who's saying, here's what I think happened, but let's just be clear, I don't really know.
But I don't believe in these grand orchestrated conspiracies as much as I believe in people taking advantage of an opportunity in a moment, and that there's a very clear pattern of them doing that forever.
Yeah. opportunistic seems easier to explain, and it is also in alignment with the way that we understand that model, that it exploits opportunity to advance itself. I feel like that the credibility took its biggest hit in 2008 when the banks were bailed out, when ordinary people suffered at a point when it was clear that the economic model couldn't function anymore and needed radical revision, and it was kept alive. And like these,
I remember that being very impactful moment. I remember when Bush signed that TARP or whatever that was, and I just thought, man, things are gonna change. Like something just shifted when that happened.
and what happened, I feel like, is that the liberal establishment ceded that territory and meant that now the only anti-establishment rhetoric is coming out of Breitbart and Bannon and Trump, and they're the only people that are attacking the establishment and the authoritarianism that's coming out there and the exploitation. There's no voices, and the voices on the left have become kind of muted. It feels to me that during the 2016 election that they would rather have Trump win than have the Democrats win under Bernie Sanders. They made a bunch of like odd decisions that shows you that that Hicks's metaphor stays ultimately true, and in a way, doesn't it make sense that if you want to maintain that, the number one thing you have to prevent is a broad alliance and a willingness of people to accept their differences. As long as you've got people willing to kill each other, whether it's online or in person, over cultural values, rather than accept, I'm willing to accept that that's how you live, as long as you accept that's how I live.
Yeah, this would bring people together, right? That's the thing that, like, all, historically speaking, all tyrannies fear is a group of people that wake up and come together. And even being able to do that while we have differences, this is one of the projects of this channel, is to see if we can have meaningful dialogue. And so far, I've actually had some pretty meaningful dialogue. If you're leaving comments and stuff like that, I appreciate it. But what can bring people together, even though we have differences? I think being willing to be wrong. I think having a sort of a philosophical mind, and that means sort of open to being challenged and open to being changed. And one of the things that I have said before is that I think ideology is the enemy to good theology. And ultimately, I think of an understanding of who God is and how my idea of God will really is really the most important thing about me, and it really does influence how I live. That is a powerful idea, you know? And I know that probably, like, Christians get a lot of flack for maybe being divisive, and certainly Christians can be, but ultimately what you see, the biblical vision for humanity is one that is united despite our differences, that there is a unity in the midst of diversity, which is actually reflected in God himself. God is a Trinity, according to the Bible: Father, Son, Holy Spirit, one being in three persons. That's a fascinating idea to look into, because that's a concept of unity amidst diversity. And here we are wondering, how can we find the same thing in our own life experience when it seems like everything is so divisive today? There's no common ground for us today. So yeah, again, I spend more time agreeing with Joe Rogan than you might think.
Then it's over.
As long as you can keep people at each other's throats, then you can continue to manipulate them. Then it's an easy chess game.
See, there you go.
As soon as people come together and they realize, like, hey, we have way more in common than we do difference. What do we really want? Everyone wants a safe neighborhood. You want good education. You want healthy food. You want people to be able to pursue their dreams. You want people to have a good time, and the more people you're around that have a good time, the better the quality of your life is going to be as well. The better the quality of life in your entire neighborhood. And if you have this mentality of great fortune and not a famine mentality, not have this mentality that all the success has to come to me and all these other people can go f themselves and it's a dog-eat-dog world. If instead you go, wouldn't it be better if we all just did our best to work together as a community and just accept?
You know, the dog-eat-dog world thing is interesting, because that's an evolutionary model. You see that in nature, right? The survival of the fittest, the strong survive, that type of thing. And so nature does give us this depiction of dog-eat-dog world. So I don't think that you can have a truly communal, unified vision for humanity that comes out of a naturalistic worldview, because nature is bred in tooth and claw. And I think we've seen that over the past 100 years, that as soon as we said God is dead, I mean, a lot of people died. There was something else that he said that triggered an idea, but now I forget. We'll have to go back.
As soon as people come together and they realize, like, hey, we have way more in common than we do difference. What do we really want? Everyone wants us.
Yeah, more in common than we have difference. Sorry, it took me a second. This is one of the reasons that motivated me to do this episode. I actually want to do the Graham Hancock and Randall Carlson stuff. I want to dive into that, but Joe, it's just giving me too much to think about right now. And so when I hear that, I go, yeah, like, this is what I'm talking about. This is why I am taking the time to like record these videos and do this, is that I'm not interested in like as a Christian person, I want people to find Jesus the way that I found Jesus. But one of the things that I think Christian people get wrong is that we want to convert people to good theology. We want to convert people to our own theology. When I've sat down and talked with people who use totally different language than I do, but I feel like we're talking about the same thing. So maybe we might disagree on the language, but I think ultimately the ideas are not that far off from each other, and I'm willing to accept that. I think God sort of accepts me that way. God accepts me even though truly my theology is off, you know? So certainly there are points that, as far as like salvation is concerned and things like that, you kind of have to get right. It's a narrow miss, you know? But yeah, ultimately we have more in common than we have apart. I think that I agree with that. I'm gonna go with that. I think I agree. And I think Christians would realize that they have more in common with other people than they realize if we weren't so ideologically locked into our theology, if that makes sense. I hope I'm unpacking that. Like, ideology is the enemy of theology. I feel like theology is the queen of the sciences, right? You have to approach it with humility, the realization that you don't have it all figured out. And so I can learn from people like Joe Rogan, Russell Brand, et cetera, et cetera. We can learn from each other.
Accept people for their differences and recognize that most of these differences are kind of bullshit. Like, it doesn't matter. I don't give a fuck what music you like, what movies you enjoy, or how you like to dress. I don't care. No. I want you to be happy. If you like to wear pink all day and fucking you like to put braids in your hair, good. Who cares? Who gives a fuck? I don't care. And if you think about your own life and your own pursuit,
I do try to bleep out all of the cuss words. So if I miss one, I apologize.
Of happiness and your own interests, and concentrate on that more than you do stopping people from behaving in a way that you're ideologically opposed to. And that ideology, you've probably been manipulated in some way, shape, or form. You've probably fallen into some fucking Rachel Maddow narrative or some Bill O'Reilly narrative, and you're just like at the throats of the people that are different than you, because somehow or another diminishing them you think is going to empower you. And you know, that's the weirdness of it all.
I think you're right that we become parasited. You know, I know you admire Terence McKenna. His famous thing, the culture is not your friend.
Yes.
The culture isn't your friend. And it feels like, that many of us have been parasited in our minds, that we are on rails, parroting and citing views that are not ours, that we don't know how that opinion got in there. And this is why the individual does have power. I've always found it hard to...
Yeah, so this idea of like a parasite idea that's sort of given to you, that's implanted. This is interesting because G.K. Chesterton said something, it was like 100 years ago, that Christianity has died 1,000 times, but it has a God who knows the way out of the grave. And his point was that Christianity often falls victim to these heresies. And then what happens is people blame those things as though those heresies are Christianity when they're not. And so over time, the heresies die off, and it looks like Christianity dies off, but really what has died is this sort of parasitized idea. The other thought is, how do we prevent ourselves from being manipulated? How do we prevent ourselves from being suggested, having these sort of suggestible ideas be implanted in our minds? And you have to be a free thinker. You have to be empowered by the Spirit of God, I think. You have to have the Word of God as your guide, and that is the way. Is it impossible? No, of course everybody can be manipulated, but I would speak to that if you're just out there walking through life with sort of a naturalistic worldview, I think you're hosed, man. I think you are vulnerable to manipulation in some ways. All right, we're gonna find another spot.
I was having a conversation with Eric Weinstein the other day where he's explaining to me the reality of other dimensions and the measurable reality of other dimensions, that we absolutely know that they exist. And do other beings have access to them? Can they travel through these things? Is that what we're dealing with? Imagine if that becomes at the forefront of the zeitgeist, if people recognize that not only are there other dimensions, multiple other dimensions that are recognizable, measurable, you know where they are, you know how to get to them, but beings are coming from those dimensions and visiting us on a regular basis.
Let me propose an idea. I think sometimes we look at like different dimensions as though those dimensions are islands and isolated from each other, and then there's these beings that will travel in and out of different dimensions. Rather than that, let me propose an idea, which is that the total view of reality includes the earthly and the heavenly, and maybe more if you want. But it's rather than like islands, and I'll do a better video on this, maybe more in depth. But there's like concentric circles built out into a total view of reality. Reality, and the truth of that reality is. Well, so truth is reality perceived by the mind of God. God is the only one who has the full view of that reality. And thankfully, as a Christian person, I believe that God has revealed truth to us down into this level. But more than like islands, it's like concentric circles, and there's levels of reality. Dr. Michael Heiser would be a good reference if you've ever listened to any of his stuff. He's got a ton of stuff on YouTube, but about the heavenly realm, basically. So they're like earthly, material, and then heavenly and spiritual. I mean, this is Dante's Inferno. I think, isn't this Socrates? Socrates talks about this in the Republic. I believe also. But yeah, so I would say rather than like the different islands, I just expand my view of reality to include these other dimensions. And talking about Michael Heiser, we know for sure that heavenly beings have come to Earth and visited Earth. So this is nothing new. This is just old news happening to new people in a way.
Are you still going to give a shit about whether or not someone has pink hair or blue hair, or who does this or who comes across what border? You're going to go, holy shit, there's a bigger thing going on. There's something that transcends all physical reality as we know it. It's beyond our imagination.
I love it.
And it is reality.
Yes, we're fetishizing, understandably, the only measurable part of our reality, while knowing even deeply personally for our own subjectivity that there's something else within us. There is our experience of rational thought, there's our experience of bodily sensation, but there's something else within us. I've been unable, of course, because of my recovery to...
Yeah, he's going to go into some other, his 12-step experience in spirituality, but I just think that that's fascinating, that here we are again on Joe Rogan talking about the need for understanding transcendence. And right there, we're going to take a break. We're going to release the second part of this interview later. I hope you stick around. I realize splitting this into 2 different episodes, my fear is that people will miss the end part, which I think is really good. I think we've covered some really good ground so far, and I do hope you'll stick around to the second one. There's just so much here, and I don't want to trim too much out. I'm trying to keep things at about 30 minutes, so I think we have enough for 2 episodes. So I hope you enjoy episode 2 coming up. It's probably linked on the screen somewhere in this mystical, magical world we call the internet. See you there.